She didn't run. She didn't fight. She didn't scream. She simply disappeared. One ordinary Wednesday morning, a mother of two kissed her husband goodbye, buckled herself into her silver Honda, and drove toward the Oregon coast. She never came back. No body was ever found. No struggle, no blood, no note, no trace. Just a car sitting alone in a gravel parking lot at the edge of a cliff, doors unlocked, keys missing, and a purse on the passenger seat with every piece of her identity still tucked neatly inside. It was as if the fog that rolled in off the Pacific that afternoon simply swallowed her whole. For 12 years, her husband waited. For 12 years, her daughters grew up without her. For 12 years, the case sat in a dusty cardboard box in a county evidence room, untouched, unanswered, forgotten by the world, but never, not for a single day, forgotten by the people who loved her. And then, just when everyone had accepted the worst, the impossible happened. The phone rang, and the voice on the other end of the line was hers. This is the story of Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell, a woman who vanished from one life and without knowing it, built another. A woman who disappeared not just from her family, but from herself. A case so strange, so heartbreaking, so deeply human that even the detectives who worked it struggled to find the right words. You have to understand what Portland was like in the summer of 1995 to really feel this story. This wasn't the Portland of today, the coffee shop culture, the tech corridors, the food trucks on every corner. This was a city still living inside its Pacific Northwest identity. Quieter, more insular, the kind of place where neighborhoods actually knew each other, where a missing local woman would make the front page of the Oregonian and stay there for weeks. The summers were short and precious, the winters long and wet, and the Oregon coast, that jagged, fog-wrapped stretch of cliff and black sand and churning Pacific Ocean just 90 miles to the northwest, was the place people went when they needed to breathe. It was the kind of landscape that gave you space to think. Or, if you weren't careful, space to disappear. Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell was born on the 8th of March, 1965 in Eugene, Oregon. She grew up in a small house surrounded by Douglas firs, the daughter of a retired schoolteacher and a postal worker who believed deeply in the value of a good education, a steady routine, and a home full of warmth. By all accounts, Sarah absorbed every one of those values. She was the kind of child who collected things, stray cats, library books, neighborhood kids who had nowhere else to go after school. Her mother used to say that Sarah couldn't walk past something hurting without stopping to help. That quality never left her. She moved to Portland after graduating from the University of Oregon and enrolled at Portland State University to earn her degree in education. Those who knew her in college described her as thoughtful and quietly funny, the kind of person who listened more than she talked, but said something worth remembering when she did. She graduated in 1987. She started teaching third grade at Bridal Mile Elementary School in the Selwood neighborhood the following fall. And she was extraordinary at it. Her classroom was the one kids begged to be placed in, the one parents requested specifically. The walls were covered in student artwork, handwritten poems, photographs of science experiments and field trips and celebrations. Sarah believed, really believed, that every child who walked through her door had something remarkable inside them that just needed the right conditions to grow. She was 22 years old and had already figured out what most people spend a lifetime searching for. She had found her purpose. And then, in the spring of 1988, she met David Mitchell at a mutual friend's backyard barbecue in southeast Portland. David was 26, quiet, steady, the kind of man who showed up on time and meant everything he said. He worked as a junior accountant at a mid-sized firm downtown. He drove a sensible car. He called his mother every Sunday without being reminded. He wasn't flashy or dramatic or particularly interesting on the surface. but Sarah saw something in him that not everyone could see right away. Dependability. Genuine, unwavering, show-up-every-day dependability. For a woman who had spent her whole life showing up for other people, that quality felt like oxygen. They dated for a year. He proposed on a hiking trail in the Columbia River Gorge on a gray November afternoon that turned unexpectedly sunny. She said yes before he finished the sentence. They married in June of 1989 at a small church in Eugene, surrounded by family and close friends. The photographs from that day show two people who look genuinely, uncomplicated happy. Sarah in a simple white dress with wildflowers in her hair. David in a suit that didn't quite fit the way it should have, grinning like a man who couldn't believe his luck. They settled into the house on Selwood Street, a modest two-bedroom with a porch swing and a backyard big enough for a garden. They planted tomatoes that first summer, built a raised bed together on a Saturday afternoon, arguing cheerfully about whether to add marigolds along the border. They added marigolds. Emma was born in the spring of 1990. Lily followed in the fall of 1992. And for a few years, at least on the surface, life was exactly what they had hoped it would be. But here is the thing about surfaces. They only show you what's facing up. Beneath the backyard barbecues and the Sunday church services, and the cheerful parent-teacher conferences, and the hiking weekends in the gorge, something had quietly begun to shift inside Sarah Mitchell. It started gradually, the way these things always do. Friends noticed it first, a slight withdrawal, a tendency to go quiet in the middle of conversations, as though her thoughts had taken her somewhere else entirely. She missed a few social gatherings she would normally have attended without question. She stopped returning calls as promptly. When asked if she was all right, she would smile and say yes, of course, just tired, the kind of answer designed to end a conversation rather than continue one. David noticed too. He noticed the way she stared at nothing during dinner, the way she would sit on the porch swing long after the girls were in bed, wrapped in a blanket, watching the streetlights come on one by one, the way she flinched sometimes when he touched her unexpectedly, not out of fear but out of some private world she had retreated into. He asked her about it, gently, carefully, in the way of a man who understood that pushing too hard would only drive her further away. She said she was fine. She said she was just overwhelmed. Work was demanding. The girls were a handful. She was tired in a way that sleep didn't seem to fix. She had headaches that started behind her eyes and spread slowly to the base of her skull. She couldn't always concentrate the way she used to. She said she just needed some time to breathe. David believed her, because she had always been honest with him, because there was no reason not to, because the alternative that something was genuinely, seriously wrong was too frightening to sit with. So he believed her, and he waited for her to find her way back to herself. By the spring of 1995, the school year was grinding toward its end, and Sarah was struggling more visibly than she had before. Her principal noticed she seemed distracted in staff meetings. A colleague who taught across the hall later remembered that Sarah had cried at her desk one afternoon for reasons she couldn't or wouldn't explain. Something was breaking. Quietly, slowly, without anyone fully understanding what it was. On the evening of June 13th, 1995, the night before she disappeared, David later told investigators that Sarah had been unusually subdued at dinner. She ate very little, helped put the girls to bed with a deliberateness that felt almost ceremonial, as though she were fixing each moment carefully in her memory. She kissed Emma good night. She kissed Lily. She stood in the doorway of the girls' room for a long moment in the dark, just listening to them breathe. David thought nothing of it at the time. He would think about it every single day for the next 12 years. The morning of June 14th arrived gray and cool, the way Pacific Northwest mornings do even in early summer. Sarah was up before David, which was unusual. When he came downstairs, she was standing at the kitchen counter with a cup of coffee, still in her pajamas, staring out the window at the backyard. She turned when she heard him, and she told him she needed to go to the coast. Just for the day, just to clear her head. She would drive to Cannon Beach, walk on the sand, get some air, and come home by dinner. The girls could spend the day at her parents' house. They'd been asking to visit anyway. She just needed a few hours alone with the ocean. It wasn't unusual. It wasn't alarming. It was the kind of thing she had done before when the pressure of daily life became too much, and the coast was the place she always went to reset. David kissed her goodbye. He told her to drive safely. He told her to come home soon. Those were the last words he ever said to her as the man he believed himself to be, the husband of Sarah Mitchell, a woman who was alive and present and expected home by dinner. She walked out the front door at approximately 9:15 in the morning. The next time he would see her face, it would be on a missing person poster taped to a telephone pole outside the grocery store. Sarah drove north on Highway 26, the most direct route from Portland to the coast. It was a route she had driven dozens of times, familiar enough that she could navigate it half on autopilot, the suburban sprawl of Portland giving way to the coast range, the mountains thick with Douglas fir and western red cedar, the air changing from city dry to forest damp to something salt-edged and alive as you descended toward the Pacific. Somewhere around 10:30 that morning, she stopped at a gas station in Seaside. Seaside was a small tourist town on the northern Oregon coast, the kind of place with a long concrete promenade along the beach, a handful of motels, a taffy shop that had been there since the 1940s. The gas station was unremarkable, a standard-issue highway stop with 2 pumps and a small convenience store. The attendant, Oregon, still required full-service gas in those years, remembered Sarah clearly enough to give a detailed description when investigators came asking a week later. She had pulled in driving a silver Honda Accord. She had asked him specifically for directions to Cannon Beach. She had seemed calm but preoccupied, present enough to be polite, but clearly with her mind on something else. She paid cash for a full tank, bought a bottle of water from the cooler inside, and drove north on Highway 101. The attendant said she seemed fine. Not distressed, not frightened, not like someone in danger. Just a woman on her way somewhere. That was the last confirmed sighting of Sarah Mitchell alive. She drove north on Highway 101 toward Cannon Beach. The drive from Seaside to Cannon Beach is only about 10 miles, a winding coastal highway through small beach communities, occasional ocean views through the trees, the smell of salt and pine thickening with every mile. At some point during that 10-mile stretch, or shortly after arriving at her destination, Sarah Mitchell disappeared from the world. And no one noticed until evening. The Oregon coast in June is a temperamental place. The morning might be crisp and clear, the kind of day that draws tourists out in layers and sends them home sunburned and surprised. But by afternoon, without warning, the marine layer can roll in from the Pacific like a slow-moving wall, thick, cold, reducing visibility on the coastal roads to almost nothing. That's exactly what happened on June 14, 1995. By early afternoon, a dense fog had settled over the northern Oregon coast. Highway 101 became a tunnel of white. The massive offshore sea stacks near Cannon Beach, Haystack Rock, the Needles, vanished entirely into the gray. The trails above the water became treacherous, edges blurring into sky, distances becoming impossible to judge. By 6 o'clock that evening, David was beginning to worry. Not panicking, not yet, just that low hum of unease that starts when someone you love is later than expected without explanation. He called Sarah's parents to ask if she had stopped by on the way home. She hadn't. He called her sister Jennifer in Seattle. Jennifer hadn't heard from her. He called 2 of her closest friends. Nothing. By 8 o'clock, worry had sharpened into fear. By 10 o'clock, with his daughters asleep upstairs and the phone still silent, David Mitchell called the Clatsop County Sheriff's Department. The dispatcher took his information, made a note, told him there wasn't much they could do before morning. Adults were allowed to take trips without informing anyone, and the required waiting period for a missing persons report hadn't passed. But a patrol officer was sent to check a few known areas along the coast. Nothing was found that night. The next morning, a jogger running the coastal trail near Ecola State Park spotted something in a small gravel pullout just off the main road. A silver Honda Accord. Sitting alone. Engine cold. Dew on the windshield. The parking lot was small, just a wide spot carved out of the hillside, used mostly by day hikers heading down to Indian Beach or up to the park's higher viewpoints. It was not unusual to find a car there in the early morning. Hikers came at dawn sometimes to catch the light over the sea stacks. But something about this one was wrong. The jogger, a retired teacher from Cannon Beach named Gerald Fowler, who ran this stretch of trail 3 mornings a week regardless of weather, could not have articulated precisely what stopped him. The car was unremarkable. The lot was ordinary. But Gerald Fowler had been running this trail for 8 years, and something in the quality of the car's stillness, the particular way it sat, the absence of the normal small indicators that a vehicle has been recently used, the dust on the hood that suggested it had been there through the previous day's fog without being moved, made him slow his pace and look more carefully. Ecola State Park was a rugged stretch of coastline just north of Cannon Beach, a place of almost violent natural beauty. Ancient Sitka spruce forests pressed right up against cliff edges that dropped hundreds of feet to the ocean below. The trails were narrow and winding, carved into the hillside above the sea. In the fog, in the rain, in the low-light hours of early morning or late evening, it was a place that demanded respect. It was also a place where accidents happened. Gerald Fowler approached the car, peered through the window, called out, heard nothing, called the sheriff's department from a nearby payphone. Within the hour, patrol officers had arrived and begun to understand what they were dealing with. Sarah's silver Honda Accord was unlocked. The keys were not in the ignition, not in the car at all. The purse sitting on the passenger seat contained her wallet with $47 in cash, her Oregon driver's license, her credit cards, her health insurance card, and several family photographs, including one of Emma and Lily taken at a birthday party earlier that year, both girls grinning with frosting on their faces. Her light jacket was folded neatly on the passenger seat beside the purse. A water bottle, the same one she had purchased at the gas station in Seaside, still 2/3 full, sat in the cup holder. There was no note. There was no sign of a struggle inside the vehicle. There was no indication of where she had gone. And there were no footprints leading away from the car. That last detail is the one that investigators kept returning to in the days and weeks that followed. No footprints. The gravel lot had sections of soft soil at its edges, the kind of ground that would hold a shoe print easily. And yet nothing led away from the driver's side door toward the trail. Nothing led toward the cliff edge. Nothing led back toward the road. It was as if she had simply ceased to exist the moment she stepped out of that car. Search and rescue teams from Clatsop County, Tillamook County, and the Oregon State Police mobilized within hours of the car's discovery. Volunteers from Cannon Beach and Seaside joined them, spreading out across the park in organized grids. Coast Guard vessels swept the offshore waters in patterns designed to account for the current. A helicopter from the Oregon State Police flew low passes over the forest canopy, its crew scanning for any sign of color, movement, heat. They called her name into the fog. Sarah Mitchell, can you hear us? For 3 full days they searched. From first light until darkness forced them to stop. Down every trail, through every dense stand of spruce, along every cliff edge accessible on foot. They rappelled down to sections of the shoreline normally unreachable by trail. They brought in a search dog that had worked dozens of successful rescues. The dog tracked Sarah's, sent from the car to the edge of the parking lot. And then the trail simply ended. Like someone had picked her up and carried her into the sky. On the third day, with no new leads and resources stretched to their limit, the search coordinator made the call that no family ever wants to hear. The active rescue operation was being stood down. The case would transition to an investigation. Resources would be reallocated to other emergencies. The park ranger later told a reporter from the Oregonian, and you could hear the genuine bafflement in every quoted word, that in 30 years of working that coastline, he had never seen a search come up so completely empty. Not a single trace. Back in Portland, David Mitchell had barely slept. He sat by the phone in the kitchen of their house on Selwood Street, surrounded by the evidence of a family life that was still very much intact. Crayon drawings on the refrigerator, Emma's rubber boots by the back door, a half-finished grocery list in Sarah's handwriting on the counter, while something inside him performed the slow, terrible calculation of what might actually be happening. He had not eaten since the evening before. His mother had called at 7 in the morning and he had told her, in a voice he barely recognized as his own, that Sarah hadn't come home from the coast. She had arrived within 2 hours, driving up from Eugene with a casserole and a tight-lipped practicality that was her particular expression of love under pressure. She took over the kitchen, intercepted phone calls, made coffee that sat undrunk, kept Emma and Lily occupied with activities that required just enough attention to keep them from noticing how frightened the adults around them were. Jennifer, Sarah's sister, had booked a flight from Seattle that afternoon and would arrive by evening. The house filled with people who loved Sarah and had no idea what to do except be present. David moved through all of it like a man walking underwater. His mother-in-law called from Eugene, his father-in-law, colleagues of Sarah's from school who had somehow already heard, the principal of Bridal Mile Elementary, a kind and competent woman named Dr. Patricia Walsh, who called to say that the whole staff was thinking of them and if there was anything at all. He answered every call. He gave every person the same careful update. She went to the coast, her car was found, they're searching, no news yet. He said it so many times it became almost meaningless. But he kept saying it. Because saying it meant he was still in the part of the story where she might be found. And he was not ready to enter the part of the story that came next. His mother-in-law came to stay. His mother-in-law, a small, precise woman named Eleanor Burke, who had taught high school English for 32 years and brought to every challenge in life the same clear-eyed analytical rigor she had brought to her classroom, sat with David the second evening after the car was found and said very quietly, "Tell me what you actually think happened." David looked at his hands. He said, "I don't know, she's been struggling. I knew she was struggling. I didn't know how much. I think maybe more than she told me, more than she knew herself." Eleanor said, "Do you think she's alive?" He said, "I have to believe she is. I don't have any other choice." Eleanor said, "That's not the same as believing she is." He said, "No, it's not." They sat with that for a while. Then Eleanor said, "She's tougher than she looks. She always has been. She gets that from her father's side." David almost smiled. He said, "I know." Eleanor said, "We're going to find her, or she's going to find us. One of those two things is going to happen." David looked at his mother-in-law. He did not say what he was thinking, that those two things did not cover all the possibilities, that there was a third possibility, that the third possibility was the one he was working hardest to keep out of the room. He just said, "Yes." And he waited. His mother-in-law came to stay. His mother-in-law, a small, precise woman named Eleanor Burke, who had taught high school English for 32 years and brought to every challenge in life the same clear-eyed analytical rigor she had brought to her classroom, sat with David the second evening after the car was found and said very quietly, "Tell me what you actually think happened." His mother had driven up from Eugene to help with the girls. His sister-in-law Jennifer had flown in from Seattle the morning after the car was found. The house was never empty, but David was very alone inside what he was feeling. Emma kept asking when Mommy was coming home. He would kneel down to her eye level, this 5-year-old with her mother's dark eyes looking up at him with complete terrifying trust, and he would say, "I don't know yet, sweetheart, but we're looking for her. We're going to find her." He wanted to believe it when he said it. The media picked up the story on the second day of the search. Local television stations ran footage of searchers combing the coastal trails alongside Sarah's smiling school photograph, the official portrait taken at the start of the school year, the one she always complained made her hair look flat. The Oregonian ran it on page 3 of the Metro section. The headline was straightforward and devastating in equal measure: "Portland teacher missing at Cannon Beach." Tips started coming in immediately. A woman matching Sarah's description had been seen walking alone near Haystack Rock on the afternoon of June 14th. A silver Honda had been spotted heading south on Highway 101 at high speed around 7 in the evening. A fisherman out early on the morning of the 15th claimed he had seen a woman standing at the cliff edge above Indian Beach, just staring at the water. Investigators chased every one of those leads. None of them held up. The woman near Haystack Rock turned out to be a tourist from California with no connection to the case. The speeding silver Honda belonged to a teenage boy from Cannon Beach who had been sneaking out to see a girlfriend. The fisherman's account changed significantly between his first and second interviews with detectives, and his timeline didn't match anything else in the record. By the end of June, the investigation had no active leads. David hired a private investigator, a former Portland police detective named Gary Whitman, who had worked missing persons cases for 20 years and came with solid recommendations from people David trusted. He paid for Whitman's services with money withdrawn from his retirement account, a decision he made without hesitation and without regret. Gary Whitman worked the case for 6 months. He drove the coastal highway dozens of times. He interviewed Sarah's friends, her colleagues, her students' parents. He re-interviewed the gas station attendant in Seaside. He reached out to law enforcement in neighboring counties, posted to early internet missing persons databases, contacted the National Center for Missing and Exploited Adults, sent Sarah's photograph to every hospital within 200 miles. At the end of 6 months, he sat across from David Mitchell at the kitchen table and told him, with the quiet directness of a man who respected his client too much to offer false comfort, that he had nothing more to pursue. There was no evidence of foul play. There was no evidence of voluntary disappearance. There was simply nothing. Sarah Mitchell had vanished as completely and inexplicably as if she had never existed at all. And the case, officially, bureaucratically in the language of law enforcement, went cold. But before we get to the years of silence, we need to sit inside the investigation for a moment. Because there were things that detectives examined very carefully in those first months. Things that the media coverage never fully reported. Things that the Mitchell family had to live with even as they were being asked to answer questions that no family should have to answer. When a woman disappears and the only thing left behind is an abandoned car, there are 2 primary categories that investigators consider first: accident or intention. Accident was the easier one to examine. Ecola State Park was genuinely dangerous coastline. People fell. People slipped on wet trails in the fog. People misjudged distances at cliff edges. The ocean had taken people from that shoreline before and would take them again. The Coast Guard had retrieved bodies from those waters. The coroner's office in Clatsop County had processed more than one hiker who never made it home. But the searches had turned up nothing. No physical evidence of a fall. no disturbance at any cliff edge, no clothing or personal items found along any trail. The search dogs had lost the scent at the parking lot edge, which was strange. If she had walked a trail, the dogs should have followed her. The fact that they hadn't suggested she had either left by vehicle, which the car's presence contradicted, or that the scent had been deliberately or coincidentally obscured. The fog was dense enough that afternoon to scatter scent particles, the search coordinator noted in his report, but it should not have eliminated a trail entirely. The absence of any physical trace was the detail that kept Detective Hollies awake. Intention was the harder category, and it required, by necessity, a closer look at Sarah Mitchell's private life. Detectives interviewed David at length, multiple times, with the patience and thoroughness that is standard practice when a spouse disappears, because statistically, when a woman disappears, the husband is the first place you look. David Mitchell submitted to every interview without complaint. He allowed investigators to search the house on Selwood Street. He provided access to financial records and phone records and credit card statements. He gave detectives the names of every friend and family member who might have information. Nothing in any of it raised a serious red flag. David Mitchell's financial records showed no unusual activity. His phone records revealed no suspicious contacts. The searches of the house turned up nothing that suggested violence or concealment. Multiple witnesses confirmed his account of the morning of June 14th. He had been seen at his daughter's school doing a morning drop-off, at his downtown office by 9:30, and had been in the office until the school called him at 3:15 to report that nobody had come to pick up Emma and Lily. He had not been at Ecola State Park that day. He was not a serious suspect. But detectives also examined Sarah's life with the same thoroughness. They interviewed her school colleagues at length. They spoke with her closest friends. They reviewed her medical records, with the consent of the declaration of death proceedings, later, and found notation of recent visits to her general practitioner for headaches and fatigue, with no formal diagnosis and no record of referral to a specialist. They found one thing that was interesting. 3 weeks before her disappearance, Sarah had visited the Multnomah County Public Library and spent 2 hours on a research computer. The librarian who had been on duty that day remembered her, not because of anything suspicious, but because she had assisted Sarah with a search query, and the query itself had been unusual. Sarah had been searching for information on dissociative disorders, specifically on what the medical literature called fugue states. The investigative note on this was brief. Subject may have been experiencing psychological distress and researching her own condition. Possible voluntary disappearance not ruled out. When David was shown this note, he said nothing for a long time. Then he said she was always trying to understand herself. She read everything. She researched things. That doesn't mean she was planning to leave. Detective Hollies had agreed. But it had stayed in the file. And it had stayed in David's mind, in the painful way that ambiguous information stays, not resolved, not dismissed, just present. He had wondered, in the darkest of those long nights in the kitchen by the silent phone, whether Sarah had known something was wrong with her, whether she had understood, at some level she couldn't articulate, that something in her mind was breaking, whether the drive to the coast had been not a search for peace but a search for an exit. He had never allowed himself to believe it, but he had never been able to fully stop wondering. That wondering was one of the cruelest gifts of unresolved cases. The not knowing doesn't just leave a void. It fills the void with every possible answer simultaneously and forces you to live with all of them at once. There had also been one other significant investigative thread that Detective Hollies had pursued in those first months, and which had ultimately come to nothing, but had consumed a great deal of departmental resources. In July of 1995, 6 weeks after Sarah's disappearance, A partial fingerprint was recovered from the outside of the driver's door of the Honda Accord. It had not been there in the initial processing of the vehicle, or rather, it had been dismissed initially as likely belonging to Sarah herself. When the evidence was re-examined following a second request from David's private investigator, the print was more carefully analyzed. It was partial, fragmentary, degraded by 6 weeks in outdoor storage before transfer to the evidence facility. But it was not conclusively Sarah's. It might have belonged to someone else, or it might have been Sarah's print in an unusual orientation. Or it might have been deposited during the days the car sat in the lot before discovery, by any random person who touched the door while passing, an innocent hiker, a curious passerby, anyone. The print was too degraded and partial to submit to the national database with any confidence of a match. It was noted in the file. It was never explained. Detective Hollies, in a recorded interview conducted as part of a Pacific Northwest Cold Cases retrospective in 2004, said, "That print bothered me for years. It probably means nothing. It almost certainly means nothing. But in a case with no physical evidence, you hold on to the things that aren't fully explained. You have to." He paused. Then he said, "I hope if she's out there, she's all right. That's what I hope." He had been retired for a year at the time. He would live to see the case resolved. He was in his late 70s when Sarah Mitchell called David from a hotel room in Portland. He got the news from Detective Vasquez, who called him out of professional courtesy. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I'll be damned." Then he said, "I'm glad." And then he said, very quietly to no one in particular, she found her way back. The days after Sarah vanished became weeks, then months. And then, in the way that time has of moving forward regardless of whether you are ready for it, months became years. The house on Selwood Street changed in small but accumulating ways. The tomato plants in the garden went untended and eventually died. The marigolds by the raised bed spread and then were overtaken by grass. The porch swing stayed, but David rarely sat in it anymore. The rooms that had always felt full now felt like they were waiting for something that wasn't coming. David Mitchell did not allow himself to stop. He could not. He had 2 daughters to raise, a job to maintain, a life that required him to be present even when presence felt like an act of violence against his own grief. He woke every morning at 5:15, because the routine was the only structure holding him together. He made lunches and signed permission slips, and attended every school event, every parent-teacher conference, every Saturday morning soccer game on the muddy fields of the local park. He did all of it. Every single piece of ordinary fatherhood that the world required of him. And on the weekends, when Emma and Lily were settled at his mother's house or at Jennifer's apartment, he drove to the coast. Almost every weekend for the first 2 years, sometimes 3 weekends in a row without a break. He walked the same trails at Ecole State Park that the search teams had walked. He drove slowly along Highway 101 between Seaside and Cannon Beach, looking for anything that hadn't been looked for yet. He stopped at every business along that stretch, diners, motels, souvenir shops, gas stations, and showed Sarah's photograph, and asked the same question in the same careful voice. "Have you seen this woman?" Most people shook their heads. Some of them recognized her from the news coverage and offered their sympathies. A few claimed they might have seen someone similar, but the details never aligned with Sarah's description or the timeline. He kept a journal, thick, spiral-bound notebooks filled with his cramped handwriting, every tip, every lead, every conversation, every dead end. The early entries were meticulous and precise, the handwriting of a man who was still in control. As the months passed, the entries grew less structured, more fragmented. The handwriting changed. He visited the Clatsop County Sheriff's Department regularly at first, daily during the first terrible month, then weekly, then monthly. The detective assigned to Sarah's case, A quiet, methodical man named Darren Hollies, who had been with the department for 15 years, was always willing to see him, always honest. Without new information, Detective Hollies told him, there is very little we can actively pursue. We have no crime scene. We have no witnesses who place her anywhere after Seaside. We have no evidence of anyone else being involved. We don't know if this was an accident, a voluntary disappearance, or something else. Without more, there is nothing concrete to investigate. David understood that. He just couldn't accept it. Sarah's sister Jennifer, back in Seattle, called every week. Her parents came down from Eugene as often as they could manage. The wider circle of friends and colleagues who had been so present in those first weeks gradually, unavoidably, returned to their own lives, because the world kept moving even when it felt unconscionable that it should. David was left with the silence, and with two little girls who needed him to be present inside that silence. Emma processed the loss in the way that 5-year-olds process incomprehensible things, in fragments, in drawings, in questions that came out of nowhere at bath time or in the car on the way to school. Where did Mommy go? When is she coming back? Did she go to heaven? Did she leave because I was bad? That last one was the one that broke David every time. He would pull Emma close and hold her with the fierceness of a man trying to physically prevent damage from happening to something precious, and he would say, "No, sweetheart, never, not ever. Mommy loved you more than anything, more than the whole world. Her leaving had nothing to do with you." He believed it when he said it. He just didn't know how to explain what it did have to do with. Emma began drawing pictures of her mother during that first year. Elaborate crayon compositions of their family, Sarah and David and Emma and Lily, all holding hands in front of the house on Selwood Street. The sun, a yellow circle in the upper corner of the paper, the way children always draw suns. Complete, intact. The way things used to be. Her teacher at Bridal Mile Elementary, the same school where Sarah had taught, quietly kept a folder of those drawings. She didn't tell David about it for years. When she finally gave it to him, long after the resolution of the case, he sat at the kitchen table and looked at every page and couldn't speak for a long time. Lily was different. She had been only 2 years old when Sarah disappeared. At that age, the conceptual framework for understanding loss, for holding onto a person's face, their voice, the particular warmth of their presence, simply doesn't exist yet. Lily was growing up in the negative space of her mother's absence, filling in the gaps with borrowed memories, stories that David told her, photographs that she studied so often the edges became soft. A single voicemail that Sarah had left on David's work phone the week before she disappeared, talking about nothing important, reminding him to pick up milk, saying she loved him, asking him to call back when he got a chance, that David eventually transcribed word for word into a letter and put in a box marked Lily. For when you're older. Lily grew up knowing her mother only through the testimony of other people. Every child deserves to know their own mother. And Lily Mitchell would spend her entire childhood without that. David never remarried. His friends, careful, well-meaning, not always wise, began suggesting after a year or two that it might be time to move forward, that the girls needed a mother figure, that he was young enough to find happiness again, to build something new. He listened to all of it with patience, and then said the same thing every time, quietly and without anger, as though it were simply a fact he had arrived at through careful consideration. I made a vow before God. Until I know what happened to Sarah, I am still her husband. That was not stubbornness, though some people mistook it for that. It was fidelity, an unwillingness to write the ending of a story that had not yet been resolved. David Mitchell refused to close the book on his wife until he knew what had happened to her, even when the evidence suggested the worst, even when years became a decade and the world had long since moved on. He kept one photograph of Sarah on the mantel in the living room. It was from a hiking trip they had taken to the Columbia River Gorge the summer before she disappeared. She was standing on a viewpoint trail, her hair blowing sideways in the wind off the water, her face turned slightly toward the camera, laughing at something David had just said that neither of them would ever be able to remember. That photograph stayed on the mantel. Through every Christmas, every birthday, every unremarkable Tuesday when its presence was the only evidence in the room that Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell had ever existed. By 1997, 2 full years after Sarah's disappearance, the case had been inactive for over a year. The Oregonian ran a brief anniversary piece, the kind of retrospective journalism that local papers do when a notable case remains unsolved, with an updated photograph of David and the girls, and a quote from Detective Hollies saying that the department remained open to any new information. No new information came. David was still posting flyers. He had discovered the early internet and was maintaining a page on one of the first missing persons websites, a rudimentary thing by any modern standard, just text and a photograph and a contact email, updating it every few months with a note that Sarah was still missing and any information would be gratefully received. The tips had slowed to almost nothing by now, but they hadn't stopped entirely. Every few months, something would surface. A woman matching Sarah's description seen in a diner in Medford, a silver Honda registered to someone with a similar name in Klamath Falls, a handwriting sample from an unsigned letter someone claimed was from Sarah. Each one sent David's heart into his throat. Each one came to nothing. The cruelest part of missing persons cases is not the initial loss. It is the repeated, ongoing, never-quite-ending cycle of hope and disappointment that stretches across years and then decades. Each false lead is a small death. Each dead end is a renewed grief. And yet the alternative, giving up hope entirely, feels like abandonment. So you keep following the leads. And you keep grieving. And you keep both of those things alive inside you simultaneously. By 2000, 5 years after Sarah's disappearance, Emma was in middle school and asking harder questions. Not the simple why of a small child, but the complex, searching questions of a 12-year-old who had been doing her own quiet research. She had found old newspaper articles about her mother's disappearance at the school library, printed from microfiche by a librarian who didn't realize the connection. She brought them home and spread them on the kitchen table one evening and asked her father to sit with her and answer her questions honestly. David sat down, and he answered every question she had. He told her about the car at Ecola State Park, about the purse and the jacket and the missing keys, about the search and the private investigator and the years of following dead ends. He told her that he didn't know what had happened, that the people who were supposed to know didn't know either, that he had not and would not stop looking. Emma listened to all of it. Then she asked, "Do you think she's still alive?" David was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I do, and I don't know if that's because I have reason to or because I can't bear to think otherwise, but yes, I still think she's out there somewhere." Emma looked at the newspaper photograph of her mother for a long time. Then she folded the articles carefully and put them in a folder and went to do her homework. She never brought them back out, but she never threw them away either. By 2002, 7 years after Sarah Mitchell had driven away from the house on Selwood Street and not come back, the state of Oregon did what the law required. It declared Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell legally dead. The formal declaration was filed through the Clatsop County court system in October of that year. David received a copy in the mail. He stood at the kitchen counter and held the document for a long time before putting it carefully in the filing cabinet where he kept important papers. Legally dead. 2 words that changed everything and nothing at the same time. The marriage was administratively dissolved. David was, on paper, a widower. The life insurance policy that Sarah had held through her teacher's union, which he had not touched since her disappearance, couldn't bring himself to think about, was finally released. He donated a portion of it to the Oregon Search and Rescue volunteer organization that had searched for Sarah in those first desperate days. The rest he put in trust accounts for Emma and Lily. In the Clatsop County evidence room, the cardboard box that held Sarah's case materials was moved to long-term cold storage. Sarah's brown leather purse, her car keys on the Oregon-shaped keychain, the photographs of the parking lot and the abandoned Honda, the witness statements, the maps with the search grids marked on them. All of it went into a box, into a room, behind a door that nobody opened anymore. The case file was marked inactive. Cold. Closed for all practical purposes, though no one in law enforcement ever actually uses that word. Cases are never truly closed when the subject is unaccounted for. They just stop receiving active attention. And in the house on Selwood Street, life continued. David worked. The girls grew up. Emma joined the cross-country team in high school and turned out to be extraordinary at it. The same quiet determination her mother had possessed directed into long miles on roads and trails at dawn. Lily became a reader, devouring books with the same appetite that Sarah had apparently shown as a child, though Lily had no way of knowing that. The photograph on the mantel stayed. The porch swing collected leaves in the fall and dried out in the summer sun, and was eventually replaced with a newer one that David chose at a hardware store on a Sunday afternoon with Lily, who argued in favor of a loveseat style and won. They sat on the new swing together that evening while dinner cooked. David looked at the chair where Sarah used to sit and felt the familiar, settled weight of her absence. Then he looked at his younger daughter, reading a library book beside him with her feet tucked under her, and felt something else too. Gratitude for what remained. And far away, in a place no one in the Mitchell family had thought to look, in a life that had nothing to do with Oregon or Cannon Beach or the fog-wrapped cliffs of Ecola State Park, something was happening. Something that would, in the fullness of time, change everything. But we're not there yet. Because first, you need to understand something important. Something that the medical community has known about for decades, but that the general public rarely encounters until it touches their own lives. You need to understand what a dissociative fugue state actually is, and what it can do to a human being. The term sounds clinical, technical, the kind of language that puts distance between itself and the reality it describes. But the reality is this. Dissociative fugue is what happens when a human mind reaches a threshold of unbearable stress, psychological, physical, or both, and responds by doing the only thing it has left to do. It escapes. Not into unconsciousness, not into sleep or sedation or any of the soft exits the body normally provides, but into something stranger and more complete. It abandons identity. Sheds it the way a snake sheds its skin, leaves it behind in one place and moves forward into the world without it. People who experience dissociative fugue states often travel significant distances without knowing why. They turn up in places they have no conscious reason to be, with no memory of how they got there. They may adopt new names, build new routines. Some resume functional lives with no awareness that those lives are replacements for ones they have abandoned. The condition has been documented in the medical literature since the 19th century. It is associated with severe trauma, extreme psychological stress, and, crucially, can be significantly compounded by certain neurological conditions, including tumors pressing on the temporal lobe of the brain. The temporal lobe, the part of the brain that processes and stores autobiographical memory, that maintains the sense of continuous personal identity over time, that allows a person to understand themselves as the same self who existed yesterday and will exist tomorrow. Compromise that region of the brain through injury, through pressure, through disease, and the very architecture of identity becomes unstable. Add a severe psychological crisis to that neurological vulnerability, and you have the conditions necessary for a person to simply stop being themselves, without choosing to, without understanding that it's happening, without leaving a note, because there is no one left in the moment it occurs who knows there is anything to explain. This is what the medical team at St. Luke's in Boise and the consulting neurologists at Oregon Health and Science University concluded, in the weeks after Sarah Mitchell's identity was confirmed, had happened to her. She had been carrying the tumor for an estimated 3 to 5 years before her disappearance, perhaps longer. Its growth had been slow, its effects gradual, its initial symptoms easily attributable to stress and overwork and the ordinary fatigue of a demanding life. But it had been there, pressing, quietly compromising the very region of her brain that kept her tethered to herself. And on the morning of June 14th, 1995, already emotionally overwhelmed, already experiencing what her therapist would later describe as the early stages of a severe psychological crisis, she had driven to the coast and something had broken. Not slowly, all at once. The neurologist who led the post-resolution case review published a paper on the case in a peer-reviewed journal in 2009, anonymized, with the family's permission, stripped of all identifying details. The paper was cited dozens of times in subsequent literature. It became a reference point in discussions of neurologically compounded dissociative disorders. It described the mechanism this way: a pre-existing compromise of temporal lobe function, combined with an acute psychological crisis that exceeded the patient's coping capacity, resulted in a complete rupture of autobiographical self-continuity. The patient retained functional capacities, motor skills, language, social competence, professional skills, while losing access to the personal history that constituted her identity. This pattern is consistent with neurologically mediated dissociation and distinguishable from purely psychological fugue states by the depth and duration of the identity disruption. In plain language, Sarah Mitchell had not run away, she had not chosen to disappear, she had not abandoned her family. She had broken, neurologically and psychologically simultaneously. And when she broke, the fracture was so complete that even she didn't know it had happened. She had simply found herself in a diner in January of 1996, with a coffee mug between her hands and nothing before it. And she had done the only thing available to her. She had begun again. There is something almost unbearably poignant about that. About a woman who does not know who she is, does not know she has a family who loves her, or a husband who is searching for her, or daughters who are growing up without her, but who instinctively, in the complete absence of any conscious reason to, returns to the things that defined her. She becomes a caretaker, she works with her hands, she reads constantly, she gravitates to libraries and schools and the company of children, she is instinctively good at it. She does not know why. She just is. The self, it turns out, is harder to erase than we might think. Even when everything conscious has been stripped away, something remains. The habits of love, the instinct toward care, the particular way a person moves through the world that is theirs and no one else's. Rebecca Collins Carter was not Sarah Mitchell, but she was made of everything Sarah Mitchell was. And eventually, with the help of a surgeon and a tumor and 12 years of a life fully lived, she found her way back to the name that fit. Hey, before we go further, I need a quick moment with you. If you've been watching this channel for a while, you know we don't do this lightly. We don't cover these cases for shock value. We cover them because real people, real families were destroyed by them, and real people, real families found their way through them. This case is about to take a turn that will genuinely surprise you, But before we get there, I want to ask you something. Drop a comment right now, just 2 words, still here. That's it. That's all I need to know, because the algorithm is watching and every comment tells it that this story matters and that you want more stories like it. Still here, drop it in the comments. And if you haven't already, smash that like button right now. It takes 1 second and it means the world to the channel. Now, let's talk about what was happening in Boise, Idaho. In early 1996, less than 8 months after Sarah Mitchell had vanished from the parking lot at Ecola State Park, a woman walked into a small family-owned diner on the eastern outskirts of Boise, Idaho. She was alone. She sat down at the counter. She ordered coffee. And when the owner of the diner, a 62-year-old woman named Martha Henderson, who had run that diner for 23 years with the quiet authority of someone who had seen everything and could not easily be surprised, came out from the kitchen and looked at this woman, she immediately understood that something was wrong. Not dangerous wrong. Not threatening wrong. But deeply, quietly, concerningly wrong. The woman at her counter was somewhere in her early 30s. Brown hair, cut unevenly as though she had done it herself. She was wearing clothes that were clean but didn't quite fit, a sweatshirt too large, jeans too short, sneakers with no socks despite the January cold. Her hands, wrapped around the coffee mug, were shaking slightly. Martha asked her if she was all right. The woman looked up. Her eyes, Martha would later tell investigators, were the most disorienting thing about her. Clear and intelligent and present, but also somehow very far away. Like looking through a window that opened onto a completely different view than you expected. The woman said, "I think so, I'm not sure." Martha asked where she had come from. The woman said, "I don't know." Martha asked her name. And the woman was quiet for a moment that stretched just long enough to be strange. Then she said, "Rebecca, I think my name is Rebecca." Martha Henderson had run a diner for 23 years. She had fed construction workers and college students and truckers and families on road trips and young couples on first dates and old couples who had been coming every Sunday for decades. She had met her share of people in difficult circumstances. She understood instinctively when someone was simply down on their luck and when something more serious was happening. She sat down on the stool next to the woman who called herself Rebecca. She poured her own coffee. And she started asking careful questions in the way that experienced, kind people do, not to pry, but to understand, to find the shape of the problem before trying to solve it. What the woman called Rebecca told her, over the course of the next hour, was this. She didn't know where she had come from. She didn't know how she had got to Boise. She had a sense of having been traveling for some time, days, maybe, or longer, but the details were entirely absent. She had no identification, no wallet, no money except a handful of change in her jacket pocket, no keys because she didn't seem to have a car, no phone because this was 1996 and not everyone had one. She had her name, or thought she did. She had her body and the clothes on it. And she had nothing else. Martha Henderson did not call the police. She would later explain why, and her reasoning tells you something important about the kind of person she was. She had called the police before on people who seemed disoriented and frightened, and the encounters had not always gone well. She was concerned about what might happen to this quiet, clearly fragile woman if law enforcement became involved before the woman herself had a chance to stabilize. Instead, Martha made a practical decision. She offered Rebecca a job. Washing dishes, wiping tables, sweeping the floor at closing. The pay was modest, but it was honest, and it came with a room. The diner building had a small apartment on the upper floor that Martha had been renting out periodically since her own children had grown and moved away. It was nothing much, a single room with a hot plate and a bathroom and a window that looked out over the parking lot, but it was a roof and a door that locked and a place to be. Rebecca accepted. She would later describe that moment, in the years after she had recovered enough of herself to describe anything at all, as the moment she stopped falling. Not the moment things got better, just the moment the ground came up to meet her. Over the weeks and months that followed, Rebecca Collins, as she came to be known, the surname chosen seemingly at random from somewhere in the fog of her missing memory, settled into the life that Martha Henderson had offered her. She was a good worker, quiet and efficient and conscientious in ways that suggested a deeply ingrained work ethic, whatever the source. She learned the diner's routines quickly and took on more responsibility without being asked. Martha began to rely on her. The regulars at the diner took to her. She was pleasant in the careful way of someone who understood that their social interactions needed to be managed with some deliberateness, not cold but measured. She remembered names and orders and details about people's lives, which is either a skill or a gift, and she possessed it naturally. People liked her. They just sensed that she was not entirely accessible, that there were rooms inside her that were locked. She settled into Boise the way a person settles into a coat that doesn't quite fit, not perfectly, but adequately. She saved money, found a small studio apartment 4 months after arriving, a ground-floor unit in a quiet neighborhood with a small garden she began tending with what felt like muscle memory. She bought second-hand furniture at estate sales. She checked books out of the public library in quantities that amused the librarians. She built a life. Small, careful, functional. And she never spoke about where she had come from. Not because she was deliberately withholding, but because, as best she could explain it to herself, there was simply nothing to tell. Before the diner counter in Boise, January of 1996, there was nothing. Not blankness exactly, not the sense of a curtain drawn across something visible on the other side. Just nothing, like trying to remember being born. The information existed somewhere, presumably in the biology of her brain, but the access to it was simply not there. She occasionally had sensations, not quite memories, more like echoes. The smell of pine trees would sometimes trigger something that felt like it wanted to resolve into an image but never quite did. The sound of children's voices would bring a feeling, not quite recognition, but an ache in the vicinity of where recognition should be. Once, walking past a school in October of that first year, she had stopped on the sidewalk for a full minute, listening to the sound of a classroom through an open window, feeling something in her chest that she could not name. She moved on. She didn't push at the empty spaces. She had, without anyone telling her, arrived at an intuitive understanding that pushing too hard at things she couldn't remember might not lead anywhere good. That the foundation she was standing on, small and inadequate as it sometimes felt, was what she had, and that protecting it mattered. Martha Henderson watched all of this with the careful, unobtrusive attention of a woman who had raised 3 children and run a business alone for 2 decades. She did not push either. She gave Rebecca space and time and the dignity of not being asked to explain herself. She extended small kindnesses without drawing attention to them. An extra slice of pie left on the counter, a warmer coat from a box of donations that happened to be exactly Rebecca's size, a word of encouragement at the end of a long shift that landed at precisely the right moment. She said once, after Rebecca had been working at the diner for about 4 months, "You know you don't have to explain yourself to me. You don't owe me your history. All I need from you is the work, which is good, and the company, which is also good. Everything else is yours." Rebecca had nodded. She had not said anything, but something in her had relaxed, very slightly, for the first time since she had come through the door. Martha Henderson became, in the language of the life Rebecca was building, the closest thing to family that Rebecca had. She was the one who helped Rebecca apply for a state ID, a patient, difficult process that required navigating the system as a person with no documentation, which was possible but not easy. She was the one who helped Rebecca open a bank account, file for a social security card, acquire the basic bureaucratic architecture of an American life. She was the one who vouched for her to the landlord of the studio apartment when Rebecca was ready to move out of the room above the diner. She did all of this without making Rebecca feel like a charity case. She did all of this because it was the right thing to do. Martha Henderson was not a dramatic person. She was not the kind of woman who made speeches or drew attention to her own goodness. She was simply a woman who saw someone in need and responded to that need with practical, sustained, undemonstrative kindness. Rebecca was, in the years after she knew who she was, unable to talk about Martha Henderson without becoming emotional. She said, "I owe her everything. Not just the job or the room or the ID. The life. She gave me the framework to build a life when I had nothing. I don't know what would have happened to me without her." Martha Henderson, by the time the story broke in 2007, was 73 years old and had sold the diner and was living in a small house in the foothills east of Boise. She was interviewed by several news outlets in the days after the resolution of the case. She was characteristically modest. She said, "I just did what you do. You see someone who needs help and you help them. That's all." She paused. Then she said, "She was always a good worker. I always knew there was more to her than she could tell me, but it wasn't my business to ask. It was just my business to keep the diner open and make sure she was all right." She said this with the matter-of-fact simplicity of someone describing the obvious. And perhaps for Martha Henderson, it was obvious. In the spring of 1998, a man named Thomas Carter stopped at Martha Henderson's diner for the first time. He was 44 years old, a long-haul truck driver with a route that ran across Idaho and into the northern tier of Utah and Nevada. He was broad-shouldered and quiet in the way of men who spend a great deal of time alone and have made peace with it. He had been married once before, briefly in his early 30s, and the divorce had been civil and sad in equal measure. He had no children. He ordered black coffee and a slice of whatever pie was freshest and sat at the counter for 45 minutes, reading a trucking trade magazine, before he noticed the woman who came out to refill his coffee cup. He noticed that she refilled it without being asked. He noticed that she had exactly the right instinct about when to chat and when to leave a person alone. He came back the following week. And the week after that. Over the course of 3 months, Thomas Carter and the woman who called herself Rebecca Collins developed the kind of friendship that builds itself incrementally, one small, honest exchange at a time, until one day you look up and realize that someone has become important to you without your having made a conscious decision about it. He didn't press her about her past. She asked him once early on whether he was curious about who she was before Boise, before the diner, before the apartment with the small garden. He thought about it for a genuine moment. Then he said, "I'm more interested in who you are now. The rest is yours to share whenever you want, or not." She didn't cry, but she was quiet for a long time after he said that. They married in July of 1999 at the Boise courthouse. Small ceremony. Martha Henderson as witness, alongside a regular customer named Bill Garrity, who had been eating lunch at the diner every weekday for 11 years and considered himself family. Rebecca wore a white dress from a second-hand shop on Overland Road. She carried a small bouquet of wildflowers that Thomas had picked that morning from the roadside on the way into town, which was exactly the kind of thing Thomas Carter did when left to his own instincts. She had no one from her past to invite to the wedding. She had no photographs from a previous life to put on the table at the reception dinner at Martha's diner afterward. She had no history to share. But she had this. A man who loved her without conditions, a community that had accepted her without questions, a life that was modest and quiet and real. For the woman who called herself Rebecca Carter, it was enough. More than enough. She told herself that on the hard nights, when the dreams came, fragmented, half-formed, achingly specific, and she woke in the gray Boise pre-dawn with Thomas breathing steadily beside her, and the residue of something that might be a memory dissolving in the morning air. She told herself it was enough. And she got up. And she went to work. And she lived the only life she had. By the early 2000s, Rebecca Carter had been in Boise for the better part of a decade. She had stopped working full-time at the diner several years earlier. Martha had retired and sold the business, though the new owner had kept on the same staff and now worked part-time as a library assistant at the Boise Public Library. It suited her perfectly. She was surrounded by books, which she loved with an intensity that sometimes surprised even her. She helped people find things. She organized and cataloged and recommended. She was good with children who came in for reading programs, kneeling down to their level with what felt like practiced ease, helping them choose books that matched their particular kind of curious. She didn't analyze that ease. She just felt it. She still occasionally had the headaches. They had been with her since before she could remember, which was to say, since Boise. A low, persistent throb behind the eyes that sometimes sharpened to something more acute, especially when she was tired or under stress. She had been to a general practitioner about them twice over the years. Both times she had been told to monitor her caffeine intake and get more sleep. Both times she had nodded and gone home, and the headaches had continued. She avoided looking at news programs. The images and stories on the nightly news sometimes triggered the echoes, those almost memories that never quite resolved, and she had found that avoiding the news was a manageable way of reducing their frequency. She preferred the library, preferred books, preferred the world as contained in paper and language rather than the raw, unmediated footage of actual events. Thomas was often on the road, that was the nature of his work, and she had learned to be comfortable in her own company. She gardened. She read. She volunteered at the library's literacy program on Tuesday evenings, working with adults who were learning to read for the first time. She found a quiet satisfaction in that work that she could not entirely explain but did not need to. Life moved in its careful, constructed way. Until 2006. In the spring of that year, the headaches changed. They had always been a background noise, present, manageable, something she had learned to live with the way you learn to live with a scar. But in the spring of 2006, they became something different, sharper, more frequent, sometimes severe enough that she had to stop what she was doing and sit very still in a dark room until the worst of it passed. Thomas noticed. Of course Thomas noticed. He had always paid attention to her in the careful, specific way of a man who understood that the woman he loved was complicated and that complications required attention. He was the one who finally said, "You need to see a doctor." Not a general practitioner this time, a neurologist. Rebecca resisted. She didn't articulate why, couldn't quite, when pushed, but there was something about the prospect of a doctor looking too closely at her brain that triggered a low, animal anxiety she couldn't reason her way out of. Thomas waited. He was good at waiting. By the fall of 2006, the headaches had become bad enough that she agreed. She sat in the office of a neurologist at St. Luke's Regional Medical Center in Boise in October of 2006, described her symptoms, answered his questions, and submitted to an MRI with the resigned calm of someone who has decided to stop fighting the inevitable. The results came back 2 weeks later. There was a mass. Small, located in the temporal region of her brain, the area associated with, among other things, memory processing, emotional regulation, and aspects of identity and self-recognition. Benign, almost certainly present for years, possibly much longer than that. The neurologist explained what this meant. A tumor of this type and location could, over time, affect memory, not in the dramatic, all-at-once way of a stroke or a severe head injury, more gradually, subtly. It could alter the way memories were stored and accessed. It could affect personality and emotional processing. It could, in certain circumstances, particularly if the person was already under severe psychological stress, contribute to or exacerbate a dissociative episode. Rebecca sat in the clean, bright office and listened to the doctor speak. She was very still. She said, "Can it explain why I can't remember anything from before a certain point?" The neurologist looked at her carefully. He asked her to describe what she meant. She described it. The absence. The year that began in a diner in Boise in January of 1996 with a coffee mug between her hands and no passed behind her. The neurologist was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It's possible, not certain, but it's possible." He recommended surgery. Rebecca went home and sat at the kitchen table and looked out at the small garden in the backyard for a very long time. Thomas came home that evening to find her still sitting there, the light fatting around her. He sat down across from her and waited. She told him everything the doctor had said. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "So we do the surgery." She said, "What if it changes things?" Thomas looked at her steadily. He said, "Then we deal with the change, together, the way we deal with everything." She believed him. She had always believed him. The surgery was scheduled for January of 2007. She went in on a gray Idaho morning, the kind that reminded her of nothing she could name, and went under anesthesia with Thomas's hand in hers until the last possible moment. The procedure took 4 hours. The tumor was removed completely and cleanly. The surgeon came out to the waiting room afterward and told Thomas that everything had gone well, that the mass was benign, that his wife was in recovery and would likely be out of the hospital within 3 days. Thomas sat back in the plastic chair and felt something unknot itself behind his sternum. Recovery was uncomfortable in the way that all brain surgeries are, the headaches of a different, stranger kind, the fatigue that went bone deep, the strange altered quality of perception in those first days when the brain is still making sense of what has happened to it. But within 2 weeks, something unexpected began. Memories. Not clear ones, not fully formed, not the kind you could sit with and examine in detail, more like signals from a distant station, almost audible, not quite resolved. Fragments of something that felt real but had no context. A kitchen with yellow curtains. A pair of small red boots by a back door. The sound of a child's laughter with a particular cadence that felt intimately familiar in a way that had no rational explanation. Names. Names surfacing in the pre-dawn half-waking, before she was fully conscious, the way things sometimes rise to the surface in that undefended border between sleep and wakefulness. Emma, Lily, David, Selwood Street. She woke one morning with those words so clear in her mind that she spoke them aloud before she was fully awake. Thomas heard her. When he asked what she had said, she repeated them and didn't understand why they made her feel like weeping. The neurologist, when she described these occurrences at her first post-operative appointment, told her this was not unusual. The removal of the tumor had reduced pressure and restored some function to areas of her brain that had been compromised for years. Memory recovery was possible and in some cases significant. The process was unpredictable. Some memories might return clearly, others might remain fragmentary or absent entirely. He said, "Give it time. Let the pieces come as they come." But Rebecca was beyond patience now. Something had been loosened, and the pull of it was becoming impossible to ignore. By March of 2007, 2 months after the surgery, Rebecca Carter was spending long hours at the Boise Public Library, not working this time, but sitting at one of the public computer terminals, searching. She wasn't sure what she was searching for. She typed words that surfaced in her mind and felt significant without knowing why. She typed phrases. She searched Oregon, she searched Portland, she searched teacher, she searched coast, she searched disappeared. Most of it returned nothing that connected to the fragments in her mind. But she kept searching, because the fragments kept coming. Because Emma and Lily and David and Selwood Street kept rising in her mind at 3 in the morning, more urgent with each passing night. Because somewhere beneath the careful constructed life of Rebecca Carter, something was pushing upward, and she was running out of ways to hold it down. In the second week of April, 2007, on a Tuesday afternoon when the library was quiet and the other patrons were absorbed in their own business, Rebecca sat down at a terminal in the far corner of the reading room and typed 4 words into the search engine. Missing Woman, Oregon, 1995. The results loaded. News archives, missing persons databases, a few academic articles, regional newspaper archives. She scrolled slowly. Near the bottom of the first page of results, there was a link. It was from the Oregonian's digital archive. The headline read, "Portland teacher vanishes at Cannon Beach, family still searching." The date was July of 1995. She clicked the link with a hand that was not entirely steady. The page loaded slowly. The article was a follow-up piece, written a month after the initial disappearance, with updated information about the ongoing investigation and a statement from David Mitchell asking anyone with information to come forward. It described the abandoned car, the missing keys, the purse with all her identification left on the passenger seat. And it contained a photograph. A school portrait, official, a woman in her early 30s with dark hair and the straightforward, slightly self-conscious smile of someone who doesn't particularly enjoy having her photograph taken professionally. The photograph had been taken, the caption explained, at the beginning of the 1994 to 1995 school year. Rebecca stared at the photograph. The woman in the photograph looked younger than she did now. The hair was a different length. The face was smoother, unlined by the years that had passed. But the features were hers. The exact set of the eyes, the particular angle of the jaw, the way the corners of the mouth sat even when not fully smiling. She was looking at herself. The library was very quiet around her. Someone turned a page. A child asked its mother something in a low voice near the children's section. The heating system hummed. Rebecca sat completely still and looked at her own face, staring back at her from an archived newspaper from 1995. And the floor of the carefully constructed life of Rebecca Collins Carter dropped away. She printed the article. 1 page, the photograph, the headline, the text. She held the warm paper in her hands for a long moment before she folded it. Something was happening in her body that she did not have language for, a recognition that wasn't quite recognition, a certainty that had no rational foundation, a feeling like the moment in a dream when you understand, without being told, that the person standing across from you is someone you love, even though their face is a stranger's face, even though nothing in the logic of the dream explains it. She knew. Not with her mind. With something deeper than her mind. She folded it carefully, so carefully, with hands that were shaking visibly now, and put it in her bag. She walked out of the library into the April afternoon. She stood on the sidewalk for a long time without moving. The traffic passed. A woman walked by with a stroller. A delivery driver pulled up across the street and carried boxes into a restaurant. The world moved around her with complete indifference to the fact that something enormous had just happened inside her. She didn't move. She stood on the sidewalk in Boise, Idaho, and felt 12 years of a life that wasn't hers pressing against the surface of the life that was. Then she walked home. Thomas was home. She found him in the kitchen making coffee, his back to the door when she came in. He turned when he heard her, took one look at her face. He set down the coffee pot. He came to her. She took the folded paper from her bag and opened it, and held it out to him without saying anything. He read it, he looked at the photograph, he looked at his wife. He read it again. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Is this you?" And she said, "I think so. I don't know, but I think so." He looked at the photograph again, at the woman who was his wife, at the photograph again. He said, "The resemblance is." She said, "I know." He put the article down on the kitchen table. He said, "What do you want to do?" She sat down at the table and looked at the photograph of Sarah Mitchell. She said, "I need to know." And he said, "Then we'll find out." He said it simply, without drama or hesitation, without self-pity about what finding out might mean for him, for their marriage, for everything they had built. Just, "Then we'll find out." She looked at him. She said, "Are you scared?" He said, "Yes, but not of the truth, just of what comes after." She said, "What do you think comes after?" He said, "I don't know, but I know you need to find out, and I know I'll be here for whatever it is." She reached across the table. He took her hand. Outside, the Boise afternoon continued its business, unhurried, ordinary. Inside, two people sat with their hands clasped across a kitchen table, preparing to open a door that could not be closed again once opened. Over the following 3 weeks, Rebecca researched with the focused intensity of a woman who has been waiting 12 years without knowing it. She found every article she could locate about the disappearance of Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell. She found the initial reports from June of 1995, the follow-up pieces, the anniversary articles, a piece from 2002, brief and factual, noting that the Clatsop County Court had issued a declaration of death in absentia. She found a quote from David Mitchell in a 2005 Oregonian article about cold cases in the Pacific Northwest. He was asked if he had given up hope. He said, "No, and I never will. Until I know what happened to her, I'm still her husband. I'm still looking, and I'll keep looking until I have an answer." Something in Rebecca's chest came apart when she read those words. Not dramatically, not audibly. Just quietly, with finality, the way a joint gives way under weight it has been bearing for too long. She knew. Not with the logical certainty of evidence, not with the proof of DNA or fingerprints or dental records, but with the deeper certainty of something that lives below evidence, below language, in the part of a person that endures even when everything else has been stripped away. She knew who she was. She was Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell. She was a teacher from Portland, Oregon. She had a husband named David. She had daughters named Emma and Lily. She had a house on Selwood Street. And she had been gone for 12 years. In the last week of April 2007, Rebecca Carter sat down with Thomas at the kitchen table, the same kitchen table where she had first shown him the article, and told him what she had decided. She needed to go to Portland. She needed to find out for certain. She needed to make contact. Thomas listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said the thing that Rebecca, Sarah, would remember for the rest of her life. He said, "If this is who you are, then you need to know, and they need to know you're alive." He said, "I'll drive you." She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "You understand what this means, what it might mean for us." He looked back at her steadily. He said, "I understand." She said, "And you're still?" He said, "I'm still driving you, yes." She reached across the table and took his hand. They left Boise on a Tuesday morning in early May. Thomas drove. Rebecca sat in the passenger seat with her hands in her lap and watched the landscape change as they moved west across Idaho and into Oregon. The high desert east of the Cascades giving way to the mountains themselves, those ancient, snow-capped sentinels she could almost feel rather than see through the pass. And then the long descent into the Willamette Valley, the air thickening and greening, and becoming something her body recognized before her mind caught up. With every mile, something stirred. Not memories exactly, more like the approach of memories, the feeling of something enormous just below the surface, pressing upward. By the time they reached the outskirts of Portland, she was crying. Not because of something specific, just because her body knew where it was. They checked into a hotel near downtown. Thomas brought in the bags. Rebecca sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the card she was holding, a plain white index card on which she had written, in her careful library handwriting, a phone number. David Mitchell's phone number. She had found it through an online directory, plain, public, freely available. She had been carrying the card for 3 weeks. She sat with it for a long time. Thomas came and sat beside her. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His presence beside her was the thing that made the next moment possible. She dialed. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, and then a man's voice answered. Hello. Rebecca's throat closed. She forced the words through. Is this David Mitchell? Yes, who's calling? A silence. Just 3 seconds, maybe 4. But the longest silence of her life. David, this is Sarah. Another silence, longer. She pressed on. I'm alive, I'm in Portland, and I'm so sorry. The line went absolutely still. Not dead, the connection was there, but no sound came from the other end for a period of time she could not accurately have measured. Then, a sound that was not quite a word and not quite not. And then his voice, barely a whisper, the voice of a man who has been holding himself together for 12 years and has just, in a single moment, been given permission to stop. Sarah, is it really you? She said, yes, I don't remember everything, but I know who I am now, and I need to see you, I need to see the girls. And David Mitchell, the accountant from Selwood Street who had made a vow and kept it for 12 years, who had raised his daughters alone and refused to move on and left a photograph on the mantel, and followed every dead end without giving up. David Mitchell made a sound that she would hear in her dreams for the rest of her life. Not a word, just a sound, like something enormous finally, mercifully releasing. The Portland Police Department moved quickly once Rebecca made contact. This was not the kind of call you assumed was legitimate without verification. Missing persons cases, especially long-running ones, attracted their share of false contacts, disturbed individuals who claimed to be the missing person, family members in denial reaching out to anyone who might give them hope, scammers who had done their research. The detective handling the cold case file, not Darren Hollies, who had retired in 2003, but a younger detective named Carol Vasquez, who had inherited the case as part of a periodic review of unresolved missing persons, took Rebecca's contact information and asked her to come in the following morning. She and Thomas arrived at the downtown precinct at 9 o'clock. The process was thorough and professionally managed. Fingerprints were taken from Rebecca and sent to the State Forensic Laboratory for comparison against prints on file from the 1995 case. Dental records were requested from 2 dentists, one in Portland who had been Sarah Mitchell's dentist from 1990 to 1995, and one in Boise whose records covered Rebecca Carter from 2000 to the present. A DNA swab was collected. Rebecca was asked to wait. She and Thomas spent 2 days in their hotel near downtown Portland. Thomas ordered room service that she mostly didn't eat. He watched television in the evenings while she sat by the window and looked out at the city lights. She told him, I feel like I'm waiting to find out if I'm real. He said, you're real. The paperwork is just catching up. On the second evening, Detective Vasquez called. The fingerprints were a match. The dental records were a match. DNA confirmation was pending, but given the other 2 results, she said, it was a formality. the woman sitting in a hotel room in Portland, who had been living as Rebecca Collins Carter in Boise, Idaho, for the past 11 years, was Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell of Portland, Oregon. Beyond any reasonable doubt, the case that had been filed as cold and inactive and essentially finished was, in the most extraordinary way imaginable, resolved. Sarah Mitchell had not died at Ecola State Park on June 14, 1995. She had walked away from her life in a state of complete dissociative amnesia, a condition in which severe psychological stress, possibly compounded by the early stages of the brain tumor, had caused a total rupture of conscious identity. She had, in the language of neuroscience, entered a fugue state. She had built a new life, without knowing the old one existed. And 12 years later, a surgical procedure on a small benign tumor had cracked the seal, and she had found her way back. The news broke nationally within 48 hours. Missing Oregon teacher found alive after 12 years. Woman with amnesia returns to family. The headlines had the quality of stories that the culture holds onto because they describe something it needs to believe is possible, that the lost can be found, that the dead can come back, that the years of waiting can mean something. Every major news outlet ran the story. Television networks sent crews to Portland. The Oregonian ran it on the front page with a photograph of Sarah and David, and their daughters taken outside the Portland Police Department the morning after the confirmation, all of them squinting slightly in the morning light, none of them smiling. All of them looking as though they are not entirely sure what has happened to them yet. It was not the story of a happy ending. It was the story of something more complicated than that. Something truer. David Mitchell, when asked by a reporter how he felt, stood in front of the cameras on the steps of the precinct and was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I don't have words for it yet. I've been saying her name for 12 years, and now she's here. I don't have words." The reunion was arranged for a Sunday afternoon. A private room at the Portland Police Department, counselors on standby, a family liaison officer to manage the logistics. Sarah arrived with Thomas, who had been beside her through every step of the preceding week with the steady, quiet presence that had defined him from the beginning. David arrived with Emma and Lily. Emma was 17. Lily was 14. They came into the building not knowing fully what they would find on the other side of a closed door. Emma had asked her father the night before, "What if she's different? What if I don't know? What if it doesn't feel like her?" David had said, "I don't know what it will feel like. I only know we're going to walk in there and find out together." The door opened. Sarah was standing near the window. She turned when they came in. She and David looked at each other across a room that was suddenly very small. He looked older. Of course he did. 12 years older. His hair had gone gray at the temples, the lines around his eyes deeper than she remembered, and she did remember now, with an increasing flood of clarity that the surgery had unlocked and the weeks of searching had accelerated. She remembered his face. She remembered the particular way he stood, slightly sideways, weight shifted to one foot, the unconscious posture of a man accustomed to waiting. She said his name, and he crossed the room, and he pulled her into his arms. And they stood there. Two people who had lost 12 years. Two people who had, each in their own impossible way, kept faith with something that most of the world had long since given up on. They stood there and held each other in a government building on a Sunday morning, while a room full of strangers tried very hard not to make a sound. Then Sarah turned. Emma was standing just inside the doorway, her arms crossed in the unconscious self-protective gesture of a teenager who is very frightened and working hard not to show it. She was taller than Sarah had expected, though she shouldn't have been surprised. The child she remembered was 5 years old, and this was a young woman of 17. She had Sarah's dark eyes and David's square jawline, and the particular set expression of someone trying to control a face that wants to do something else entirely. Sarah walked toward her slowly, carefully. She said, "Emma." Emma said nothing. Sarah said, "I know you don't remember me. I barely remember myself. But I never stopped being your mother, even when I didn't know it." And Emma, 17 years old, cross-country runner, keeper of folded newspaper articles in a folder she had never thrown away, Emma's face came apart. She stepped forward and let her mother hold her. Her body was rigid at first. Then it wasn't. Lily was standing further back, half behind her father, watching. Sarah turned to her. She said, "And you must be Lily." Lily said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "I don't remember you." Sarah said, "I know." Lily said, "I mean I really don't, not even a little." Sarah said, "I know, that's not your fault, and it's not mine either, we just have to start from here." Lily looked at her for a long time. Then she nodded, once, small and careful. It was enough. In the counseling session that followed, arranged as part of the protocol for reunification in cases of this kind, Sarah was asked to describe as precisely as she could what she remembered and what she did not. She said, "It's like my life is a book with pages torn out. The early chapters are coming back, teaching, the house, the girls when they were small, David. I remember things in flashes, something that happened in the kitchen, something Emma said, a morning in the garden. But the period just before I disappeared is still mostly dark. I remember feeling overwhelmed. I remember feeling like I was," she paused, "drowning. And then there's nothing until Boise." The neurologist who had been consulting on her case since her arrival in Portland offered his assessment to the team. The combination of the tumor's pressure on the temporal lobe, which had likely been ongoing for some time before the disappearance, and a severe acute psychological crisis had triggered what the clinical literature called a dissociative fugue state. In such a state, a person does not simply lose specific memories. They lose the sense of being the person those memories belong to. They lose continuity of identity. They become, in the most literal sense, someone else. Or rather, they become no one in particular, until they build someone new. The absence of footprints in the parking lot at Ecola State Park had puzzled investigators for 12 years. The answer, when it finally became possible to reconstruct, was pedestrian in the way that the answers to great mysteries often are. Sarah had not vanished from the parking lot. She had walked out of it. The soft soil and gravel that should have held footprints was dry after a week of no rain, the same weather conditions that had not been reported accurately in the initial coverage. Her route out of the lot had taken her across a section of compacted gravel that would not have held prints. She had walked south along a county road for approximately a mile before the first driver had stopped to offer a lift. That driver, a retired schoolteacher from Astoria who had been heading south after a day of hiking, had not recognized her from the news coverage because the news coverage hadn't started yet. He had dropped her in Seaside. From Seaside, she had walked to the Greyhound station and boarded a bus heading east. He had come forward, eventually, in the days after the story broke nationally. He had been a quietly troubled man in the intervening 12 years, wondering occasionally about the woman he had given a lift to who had seemed so very far away inside herself. The bus records no longer existed, but the driver's account was consistent with the timeline, and it filled in the last blank. Sarah Mitchell had not fallen from a cliff. She had not been taken by the ocean. She had walked away. Not knowingly, not deliberately, not as an act of will. But she had walked away. And the world had not seen it happen. The legal complications that followed were significant and required months to fully resolve. Sarah had been declared legally dead by the state of Oregon in 2002. That declaration was now void. But in the intervening period, she had contracted a valid marriage with Thomas Carter in the state of Idaho, and David Mitchell's marriage to Sarah had been administratively dissolved. Two valid marriages, one woman. Attorneys on both sides worked through the situation with the kind of careful, document-intensive precision that such cases require. The conclusion, eventually, was that Sarah would need to choose. Oregon would recognize whichever decision she made, and Idaho would process the dissolution of whichever marriage she did not choose to maintain. Sarah asked for time. It was the only thing she asked for in those early weeks, not money, not publicity, not any of the things that the media attention might have made available to her. Just time. She was given it. Thomas Carter spent 3 weeks in Portland. He stayed at a different hotel from the one where Sarah was initially housed, and he came to see her every morning for coffee before she went to meet with her family or her counselors or the lawyers. He did not involve himself in the discussions. He did not advocate for himself. He simply showed up. Every morning. With coffee. And sat with her for an hour. Because that was what Thomas Carter did. He showed up. Sarah asked him once, in their 3rd week in Portland, how he was managing. He said, "I'm all right. I knew, from the moment you showed me that article, that this was how it was going to go. I had time to get used to it." She said, "That's not true. You couldn't have known." He said, "Maybe not, but I knew something. I always knew you weren't entirely mine to keep. I just didn't know why." She said, "Thomas." He said, "You don't have to apologize. You don't owe me anything except honesty, and you've been honest." She said, "You saved my life." He said, "I didn't save anything. I just loved you while you were finding your way back. That's what you do when you love someone, you stay." He returned to Boise in the 4th week of June. The divorce papers were filed in Idaho in September of 2007. Sarah later described Thomas Carter as the most selfless person she had ever known. She kept a photograph of him, framed on the bedside table in the house on Selwood Street. David understood. More than understood. He said, "He kept you alive when I couldn't. As far as I'm concerned, I owe that man everything." Sarah moved back into the house on Selwood Street in August of 2007. It was a complicated homecoming. The house was the same in structure, same walls, same yard, same porch swing, though not the original one, she noted, and Emma confirmed that the second one had been Lily's idea. But 12 years of life without her had marked it in thousands of small ways. The kitchen had been repainted. The backyard had been replanted. Emma's room was now covered in running medals and track photographs, and the evidence of a life fully and competently lived without a mother. Walking through the rooms triggered memories with increasing frequency. She would stop suddenly in a doorway, overcome by something, the particular angle of light through a window, the smell of the bathroom, the creak of the 3rd step on the staircase. She remembered this kitchen. She remembered making pancakes here on Saturday mornings, standing at the stove while the girls were still in their pajamas, the weekend expanding gently ahead of them. Emma sitting at the counter with her cough.